Our nation of Egypt has for the last 15 years stayed in a state of limbo. While we unilaterally declared our independence in 1922 from the British Empire, the Brits have stayed in our country and are determined to keep it that way. They even have complete control over the Suez and all its trade. However, the stalemate might soon end, because in about 30 days the Anglo-Egyptian Conference will begin in London, where our diplomats will have one goal and one goal only: the complete independence of our nation. But despite all our focus being on this conference, Fuad I, our king, still had time to focus on internal matters. Because once we get our independence from the British, our own nation will be all that we have. And his focus lied in our industry, most notably in the industrial sector of Banha, a city north of Cairo. But there was also significant support provided to some of the critical institutions of our nation, such as the Bank Misr and its founder Talat Harb, who will greatly help with the management of our economy. But looking back to the conference, our diplomats have arrived to London and started discussions, expecting fierce diplomatic struggles after we announced that anything else than independence was non-negotiable. We decided to promise the British docking rights in our nation to get the upper hand as quick as possible. However, our presumptions were completely wrong, because for some reason the British government had completely changed direction and even announced that they were selling colonies. So when our diplomats arrived to London, they not only agreed to our independence, but also promised to transfer the Suez Canal to our nation as fast as possible. And all only in exchange for guaranteeing military access. Not wanting to give them time to change their minds, we immediately accepted the offer and jumped on the first flight to Cairo. And only a few days later, the Suez Canal was, just as promised, transferred back to our administration. However, independence will take a longer time to achieve, as it takes a lot of paperwork. And while it might not sound that painful, it was, because only a week or two after the Suez victory, our king died, just before he was able to see his country gain independence. In his place, his son was crowned as the new king of Egypt. During this sad time, our economic minister had increased the acceleration of our economic investments by using the money gained from the Suez Canal to develop the East and bring it up to the same standards as the rest of the country, and by starting construction of the Aswan Dam, that will not only provide electricity but also help our farmers. At this point, the paperwork of independence had finally catched up and we could sever our ties with our former colonialists. We would of course honor our agreement and provide them with the military access they requested. And so, with our independence, we immediately received letters from foreign diplomats, as we could now decide our own foreign policy. The Iranian diplomats congratulated us for our newly found independence and looked forwards to future cooperation. The Saudis did the same, but also asked if we would support their plans to unite the Arabian Peninsula. While this could have created a strong ally, our young king decided not to aid them due to his inexperience and our current internal focus. The last to reach out was the Mandate of Palestine in our east, who congratulated us for acquiring the Suez. However, there would be no further diplomatic discussions, as the country plunged into chaos, with Israeli and Palestinian forces rising up against each other and the British quickly evacuating the area. But despite this horrible conflict along our border, we continued focusing on our internal issues, the most pressing being civil unrest in Sudan. Because ever since our government took control over the region, there has been frequent cases of rebellions and protests, and after losing British support in the issue, the Sudanese separatist movement has only grown stronger. We've tried our best to fight it by using both the carrot and the stick. As a reward, we've used our income to develop the region, and we even extended the Cairo-Khartoum railway all the way south to Juba. On the other hand, as punishment, we've suppressed the separatist movement as much as possible. However, it wasn't enough, and in response to our stick policy, a group of Sudanese nationalist leaders launched an armed rebellion with the goal of giving Sudan its independence. While this might remind you of our own struggle for independence, this isn't acceptable, and our small army has already been mobilized to deal with the rebellion as fast as possible. Fortunately, despite it being incredibly weak, the growing tensions in the Middle East, with the conflict in Palestine and the Saudis starting their unification of their peninsula, made us act before the rebellion and form the National Defense Fund. A fund that will provide enough funding to kickstart the expansion and maintenance of our army. Once our forces arrived to the south, we immediately started pushing the separatists back south, with the ultimate goal to fully destroy them. Since none of us had enough soldiers to garrison the whole front line, we could use it to our advantage and outmaneuver their forces. So despite losing or abandoning some head-to-head encounters, we eventually encircled and subsequently crushed 2 divisions. Nonetheless, back in Cairo, people are unhappy about that this situation even rose up. And the justified scapegoat has been our young and inexperienced king. On one side is the parliament and all its politicians who are demanding reforms and even the abdication of our king in favor for a democratic system. And on the other side are the military officers such as Gamal Abdel Nasser and his group called the Young Officers. While it seems unlikely that the king will be deposed as he is still quite popular, the young officers have actually more support than the eye can see, because they've received aid from the Soviet Union due to their socialist tendencies. This support is even so far-reaching that they have sent 3 secret volunteer forces to assist Nasser in the Battle of Sudan and later the overthrowing of our king. And once these Soviet forces arrived to the front, things immediately sped up. First of all, we dared to conduct an encirclement of their whole effective fighting force, and it was actually successful. However, instead of clearing it out, Nasser wanted a victory as quick as possible, which meant making a beeline straight to Khartoum, then following their fleeing leaders through the whole country until we reached Juba. So with their forces encircled and all major cities captured, the separatists capitulated and their lands were once again under our control. However, this victory had come with its cost, at least for our king. Because instead of demobilizing the army, Nasser and the other prominent generals led it straight to Cairo, dismantled the royal guards, and proclaimed our king deposed, with the Egyptian Republic taking its place. Nasser, being the first president of our nation, immediately started several reforms and declared a clear stance on foreign policy. We will kick out all foreign influence completely, which was done by ending the British military access, and then begin reforming the greatness of Egypt to act as a uniting force for the Arab world. Discussions were even held with the Soviets almost immediately after taking power about the possibility of joining the Comintern. We agreed that this would be the end goal, but that our close cooperation would be hidden for now. Regarding his reforms, they were in the beginning mostly focused on education and research. For example, a rural education plan was put in place and the Al-Azhar University in Cairo was modernized. But these changes also focused on once and for all fixing the issue of Sudan, because even though the separatists have been defeated, the resistance persists. However, instead of continuing to crack down on it like usual, a completely different approach was taken. An election will be set up where the people of Sudan will be allowed to vote for either independence, limited autonomy or full integration, which was what we campaigned for. To win it, we used every page in our book. Everything from normal propaganda and promotion to using our army to subsidizing the region. So even though the popularity of full integration started at 20%, we got it over 50% by the time the elections were held and the chaos in the region was finally over. During this time, the new government had continued with the education plans as well as create the Voice of the Arabs radio station to spread our pan-Arab policy to the people of other nations. Most specifically in Palestine, where a Jewish state has been formed. But we can't uphold our foreign policy and defend our nation with only a radio station. What we actually need is an army to back it up. Since Nasser is a general and most of our power already comes from the army, this won't be that difficult. Our infantry divisions have already been expanded with both normal infantry and special desert infantry regiments. Then, at the order of the Defense Department, who has been expanded, engineering companies were also added to our troops, who will help entrench them and greatly expand their defensive capabilities. With the help of the previous education reforms, our military education and training was also improved from a state of neglect to one that we at least can start to trust in handling our doctrines. Another great bonus to our army had to do with the integration of Sudan, because now that their people are equal with Egyptians, we can desegregate the army and recruit Sudanese men as well. Together, all this allowed us to reach an army size of more than 200,000 men. An army bigger than the Saudi and Israeli, which means it's time to hunt for Nasser's dream, a united Arab Republic. However, it won't begin with war. Instead, we will try to secure more Arab lands through diplomacy. And our perfect first target is the French Stalinist government who own Syria. So we sent our diplomats to Paris and put forward our request. Unfortunately, they didn't give it for free and instead asked for a payment of 4 civilian factories. After some extra negotiations, we managed to get it down to 3, which was still a lot, but a lot more acceptable as well. And thus the deal was signed and we liberated our first Arab nation. But now that we own Syria, the Republic of Egypt is no longer a fitting name. Instead, the United Arab Republic was proclaimed, which immediately met backlash from the State of Israel and strangely enough Iran. Because after Nasser and the young officers took power, our previously good relations have collapsed. Especially after the Iranian king launched an invasion of the Arab nation of Iraq. To replace the loss of a friend, the Iranians had instead opened up to the state of Israel. And this relation was only strengthened after our acquisition of Syria, with the Iranian government even going so far as to ask our government for guarantees not to attack the Zionist state. We of course replied that we had no plans to attack them, however the situation did not stop escalating. Because soon the now united Arab Peninsula reached out to us asking for the creation of an alliance between our two nations as a counterweight to the Iranian and Israeli friendship. However, due to their plans to immediately declare war as well, we were reluctant and decided not to join. Still, once further news arrived about quite massive troop movements along our Syrian-Iraq border, we escalated the situation by partially mobilizing our own forces with the hopes to scare away the Iranians. Instead, it led to the complete opposite. The Israelis and Iranians formalized their relations and created the Middle Eastern Defense Treaty, a mutual defense pact. And this was the last straw. The Zionists are occupying Arab lands and so too are the Iranians. And now that they together announced that they stand for peace in the Middle East, we have to end this hypocrisy and occupation. So we reached back out to the Saudis and negotiated a temporary alliance with them, the Anti-Zionist Alliance. Almost immediately after the creation of the alliance, we started justifying a war goal against the Zionists and threatened the Iranians that if they didn't immediately end their alliance with Israel, they too would fall to our Arab forces. They didn't. Which means that war will begin in about 100 days and we must prepare accordingly. Fortunately, with our forces already partially reformed, more reforms weren't difficult. We, for example, improved their organization and also put forward plans to equip all our divisions with support artillery. But to have enough artillery to even do that, we also had to start a defense build-up by constructing more military factories. In the end, we were as prepared as we could have been, and it was time to evaluate our situation. Both the Iranian and Israeli armies are far more specialized, with both having shock troopers. The Iranian have even equipped their whole army with artillery, and a lot of it. However, almost everything else is pulling to our advantage. According to our limited intel, the Iranian army isn't equipped at all, which explains how they on paper have such a strong army. We also have the chance to cut off the two allies from each other by driving less than 100 kilometers. We have the strongest navy, with the only contending one being the 2 Iranian destroyers. And we will use this naval dominance first and foremost to naval invade Cyprus, which Iran for some reason bought or got a hold of from the British. Finally, the Soviets have promised us support, however the Zionists could also have foreign allies. For example, the British, who we are fairly certain supported them in their war against Arabs. After about 100 days of preparations and still no end to the escalations, Saudi Arabia declared war on Israel, with us joining only hours later. As soon as the news reached Tehran, they declared war on us, and so the war for the Middle East has started. Immediately after it began, we launched our invasion of Cyprus. However, we didn't try to split the Zionists from the Iranian just yet, since our Saudi allies had left Jaffa state open, just like we left the undersupplied eastern parts of Syria. With Cyprus easily captured, we started our offensive on land. The Saudis had already pushed into southern Jordan, capturing 2 supply hubs and reopening the possibility to split our enemies from each other by capturing Amman. Our own first objective was to capture Haifa, something which the Iranian army noticed and subsequently reinforced the city. However, this left their flanks open, allowing us to push into Jordan and later capture the city as it neared encirclement. This was when we got the news that the British had sent 2 tank divisions to help out the defense of Israel. But we didn't give up because of this and continued with our attempts to split our 2 enemies. At first it was a failure, but with the Saudi offensive that retook Jaf, we overwhelmed the Iranian army and succeeded with our operation after capturing Ruwayshed. At the same time, the Soviet forces who fought with us in Sudan had arrived in the Sinai and started attacking Israel from the west. With difficulties in the east for Israel, they broke through quite quickly, liberating for example Gaza. They would only be stopped by a second foreign intervention received by the Israelis, the Chinese. Nonetheless, the breakthrough in the west made it so that they couldn't reinforce the east, allowing our offensives to continue. And with the capture of Amman and Saudi advances reaching the Dead Sea, we encircled 8 divisions, including one of the British volunteers. Unfortunately, most got broken out except the tank, but it was still a great success. The following days, the port in southern Israel was also captured, uniting our two fronts, and the Zionist forces had soon been reduced to Tel Aviv, Jerusalem and its neighboring cities. But unfortunately, bad news arrived from Moscow. The German-Polish alliance had declared war on them, forcing them to recall their volunteers to fight against their own invaders. So we thanked them for their help and sent them on their way back to their homeland. Almost immediately after they left, Middle Eastern Defense Treaty forces, especially the Chinese, saw the opportunity to counterattack in the west. We tried our best to defend, but the strength of the Chinese forces and with the Saudis having left to fight Iran made it difficult. Soon Gaza had fallen back into the hands of the Zionists, and they entered the Sinai. It was here where our defenses almost completely collapsed, as they captured nearly the whole peninsula, including the port at its most southern tip. Fortunately, they didn't reach East Suez, as we could set up a defensive line before it to defend our heartland. And during the time they tried to push past it, we assembled a force to counter their attacks. We pushed together with Saudi reinforcements from the east, where only the weaker Israeli forces were protecting it, and together we reached the Mediterranean Sea, encircling all Chinese volunteers and 2 other divisions. To clear it out, we pushed them all to the most southern tip of the peninsula, but since they had the port, it took quite a while to destroy their forces. But with our navy in the Red Sea, they couldn't flee, as they risked getting sinked. While we waited for them to get destroyed, we consolidated our front with the Israelis, which was extra important since the Chinese had sent even more forces to the region. We also helped our Saudi allies weaken the Iranians by not only trying to encircle small amounts of their forces, but also by advancing to Iraq. However, the Chinese, now the engine of the Middle Eastern Defense Treaty, launched a second big counteroffensive, this time using 4 mountaineers which they had sent to Iran. We quite quickly realized that their ambition was to reunite our 2 enemies, which would be disastrous to our progress. In less than a few days they had captured Ruwayshed and arrived a few kilometers outside of Amman. However, we didn't idly watch this unfold. Instead, we immediately launched a counterattack from the flanks. And since the Iranian army hadn't kept up with the Chinese advances, it was successful, encircling 3 of their volunteers. But with them last standing, and as the Iranian army arrived from the east, we couldn't defeat them before they got saved. And despite this terrifying experience for the Chinese, they doubled down on their offensive, knowing that our forces, who are hardly equipped with artillery, can do little to defeat theirs. And thus they turned north into Syria, capturing Damascus and our only port in the area, Beirut. This doomed our whole northern army, as without supply and fighting against far stronger forces, all our flank attacks failed and Syria was soon lost completely, with the Middle Eastern Defense Treaty once again united. The following weeks, despite receiving support from Sweden of all nations, the Zionist armies would continue advancing, and as we realized that there was not much we could do to stop them, we pulled back our forces. The Saudis retreated first, with the plans of setting up a defensive line going straight through the center of their country, defending both their capital and Mecca, the most important city that cannot be allowed to fall into the hands of the Zionists. We, on the other hand, would hold our ground and try to hold the Sinai and assist the Saudis at the same time. It was before these massive retreats that we tried to open up peace talks, but they were rapidly shot down by both Israel and Iran. Back to our desperate defense, our line in the Sinai collapsed almost as soon as breakthrough operations started, which forced us to fully retreat to the other side of the Suez, using the canal as our shield. Looking to the Saudi line, it fortunately held, despite several dangerous attacks on Mecca. This was mostly due to the high attrition of our enemies, and since we had started fortifying the cities with actual fortification infrastructure. Back in Suez, it was a lot harder to fortify the defensive line due to the constant attacks to try and cross it. But we desperately defended, knowing that if they crossed, everything would be over, and after several close calls, the attacks finally stopped. They had realized that they couldn't cross it, despite being incredibly close. After about a month of no troop movements or offensives, we would start to receive the first few requests for peace. First the Chinese, then Iran, and lastly Israel all invited our alliance to peace talks. However, since they had denied our own proposition before our retreat, we denied any possibilities of talks. The Saudis did the same, as we were both certain that the reason they asked for peace was since they were weak. And so, the following years, the stalemate would continue, since the game had crashed and everyone left. So thanks so much for watching, and if you yourself want to join a roleplay game, there is a link in the description where you can join the Discardian Discord server, where several games are hosted each week. Once again, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.